It started like any ordinary day, until three men in what looked like police uniforms knocked on my front door. Their presence was intimidating. They had radios, dark sunglasses, and badges that, at first glance, seemed legit. But something didn't feel right. Their tone was too aggressive, their questions too vague. One of them barked, "Step outside. We need to talk about your recent violations." Violations? I hadn't broken any laws. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a random visit. This was Karen's doing. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, had always had a problem with me. From the day I moved in, she made it her mission to control every inch of my life, one bogus complaint at a time. But sending fake cops, that was a whole new level of insane. I didn't step outside. I shut the door, locked it, and called the real police. What followed was a whirlwind of discovery, federal investigation, and one of the most satisfying moments of justice I've ever witnessed. Because when you mess with the wrong person and impersonate law enforcement, you don't just cross a line, you invite the FBI to your doorstep. And that's exactly what Karen did. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was a self-declared dictator with a clipboard and an ego the size of our entire subdivision. From the first moment I met her, I knew she'd be trouble. It was the way she scanned me up and down like I was tracking dirt into her perfectly curated existence. I had just moved in, hadn't even finished unpacking, when she marched over and introduced herself. Not with a smile, but with a printed list of neighborhood guidelines. "We take pride in our community," she said, emphasizing "we" like I was some kind of outsider threatening her utopia. And from that moment on, I was on her radar. She had this way of appearing out of nowhere, always just close enough to hear what you were saying, but far enough to pretend she wasn't eavesdropping. She reported my trash bins for being out too early, by 6 minutes. She left anonymous notes about my porch light being too bright and disturbing the harmony of the block. She even accused my dog of barking too loudly, even though he barely makes a sound. And when I trimmed a tree in my front yard that apparently wasn't uniform with the rest of the landscaping, she took a photo and filed a formal complaint to the HOA board. No warning. Just an email that sounded like it was written by a prosecutor in court. What made Karen so infuriating wasn't just her obsession with rules, it was how she twisted them. She acted like she was the HOA, even though she was just a board member. She had a way of weaponizing policy, using it like a sword to cut down anything or anyone that didn't fit her personal standards. But here's the kicker. Everyone on the block was scared of her. They smiled when she passed, nodded politely, but avoided eye contact. I once saw her berate a family for having Halloween decorations that she deemed excessive. The kids cried. She didn't flinch. I tried to be civil at first. I responded to her emails. I even trimmed my grass a little shorter, thinking maybe I could avoid the conflict. But that's the thing about people like Karen. You give them an inch, and they take your entire front lawn. And then they send fake cops to your door, just to show you who's boss. Or at least, who she thinks is boss. Things started to get weird after I ignored one of Karen's many emails about the color of my mailbox. She claimed it was a shade too dark and clashed with the overall palette of the community. I didn't respond, thinking it was just another one of her nitpicky obsessions. But apparently, silence was the wrong move. That's when the real escalation began. It was no longer about HOA policies. It was personal now. Karen started filing formal complaints like it was her full-time job. One week, she claimed my car was parked too close to the curb. The next, she accused me of violating noise ordinances, even though I live alone and don't throw parties. She even snapped a picture of my recycling bin and claimed it was an eyesore on trash day. What made it worse was that the HOA board started acting like her personal minions. I began receiving warning letters, citations, and even threats of fines over completely ridiculous things. When I attended a meeting to defend myself, Karen interrupted me mid-sentence, quoting rule numbers like she was reciting scripture. The board barely looked me in the eye. She had them wrapped around her finger, or maybe they were just afraid of her like everyone else seemed to be. Then the intimidation started to cross the line. One morning, I found a chalk mark on my driveway. At first, I thought it was just a kid playing, but it was in the exact spot where my tires usually rested. The next day, it was gone, but a note was taped to my front door. "You've been warned. Comply or consequences will follow." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. Karen had a flair for the dramatic, and the passive-aggressive tone was unmistakably hers. I started noticing her more often too. She would walk her dog at odd hours, always passing by my house, always glancing at my windows like she was trying to catch me doing something wrong. At night, I sometimes saw her porch light flick on just as I turned mine off, like she was keeping watch. It was unsettling. And when I tried to talk to her directly, she smiled with that infuriating calmness and said, "I'm just enforcing the rules, neighbor." But I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't about the rules. This was a power play, and I was her target. It was a Tuesday afternoon, sunny and quiet. The kind of day where you expect nothing more dramatic than a package delivery or a dog barking in the distance. I had just made myself a cup of coffee when I heard the knock. 3 sharp bangs, loud, confident, and purposeful. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw them. 3 men dressed like cops. Dark navy uniforms, badges gleaming, belts weighed down with gear, and one of them even had aviator sunglasses tucked into his collar, like he was out of a movie. My stomach tightened. "Open the door, sir. We need to speak with you," one of them said, his voice hard and clipped. I hesitated. Something didn't sit right. There was no cruiser outside. No lights, no radio chatter. Just an unmarked black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street. I cracked the door but kept the chain locked. "Can I see your badges?" I asked. The guy in front held his up quickly, almost too quickly, like he didn't want me to look too closely. It was generic, shiny, and missing the typical agency seal. My heart started pounding. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "We've received reports of non-compliance with HOA regulations and some suspicious activity," the man replied. "We need you to step outside so we can resolve this." That was the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. Real cops don't enforce HOA rules. Real cops don't show up without proper ID, in a car with no markings, and demand you step outside without explanation. I closed the door a little and said, "Hang on." Then I locked it, backed away, and called 911. My hands were shaking, but I kept calm. I explained everything. The dispatcher confirmed that no units had been sent to my address. Her voice changed immediately. What started as routine became urgent. "Officers are on their way. Stay inside. Do not open the door again." Outside, the 3 men were still standing there, talking to each other now, glancing back at the SUV. A few minutes later, they casually walked back to the vehicle and drove off. No lights, no sirens. Just like that, they vanished. When the real police arrived, I played back my security footage. They took it seriously. One of them looked at me and said, "You were right to call." Those weren't cops, and whoever sent them meant to scare you. That was the moment it all shifted. Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She'd bulldozed right over it. The real officers arrived about 15 minutes after the imposters drove off. 2 cruisers pulled up, lights flashing but no sirens, and a pair of uniformed deputies stepped out with that calm, professional demeanor you immediately recognize as the real deal. I met them at the door, still rattled but trying to hold it together. One of them introduced himself and asked me to explain everything from the top. I walked them through it. What the fake cops looked like, what they said, how they acted, and what tipped me off. Then I handed over the footage from my security camera. The moment they saw the video, their expressions changed. This wasn't just a prank or a misunderstanding. This was serious. "They're not officers from any department around here," one of them said. "Uniforms don't match, and real law enforcement doesn't approach residents like that, especially not over HOA violations." He paused, studying the faces on the screen. "You did the right thing by calling us immediately." I could feel the tension leave my chest just a little, but it was replaced with something else. Anger. Someone had tried to scare me, to intimidate me into silence. And I was almost certain I knew who. I told them about Karen, about the threats, the escalation, the note, and her obsession with control. The officer took notes, his pen moving steadily, occasionally nodding. When I mentioned the HOA complaints and how they'd turned personal, he exchanged a glance with his partner. "You're not the first person to mention her," he said quietly. That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. He didn't elaborate, but it told me enough. Karen had a reputation, and maybe I wasn't her only target. Maybe she'd just gotten bolder this time. I asked what would happen next, and the officer explained they'd file an official report, include the footage, and forward it to the appropriate agencies, especially since impersonating an officer was a federal offense. Before leaving, one of them turned back and said, "Keep your doors locked, cameras rolling, and don't engage with anyone suspicious. We'll be in touch." As they drove off, I stood there on my porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across my lawn. I wasn't just up against an overzealous neighbor anymore. I was up against someone who thought they were untouchable. But now the law was watching. After the police left, I couldn't sit still. My adrenaline was still buzzing, and my curiosity had turned into something sharper. Determination. I needed to know who I was really dealing with. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. She was someone who had orchestrated a fake police visit. That wasn't just petty or controlling. That was criminal. So I did what anyone would do when they're desperate for answers. I started digging. I searched her name online, not expecting much. But what I found made my skin crawl. There were old neighborhood forum posts from previous communities she'd lived in, buried deep on obscure HOA complaint threads. Same name, same tone. One post described a Karen M., who allegedly filed false noise complaints against an elderly neighbor and was removed from her HOA board position. Another post mentioned someone with the same last name being sued for harassment. Coincidence? Maybe. But then it got worse. A public record search turned up something unexpected. A court filing from 3 years ago tied to her son. He'd been charged with impersonating a police officer during a traffic stop. According to the documents, he had flashing lights installed in his car and even carried a fake badge. The case was eventually dropped under a diversion program, but it was there, in black and white. The moment I read that, everything clicked. The uniforms, the SUV, the behavior. Karen didn't just know someone who might fake being a cop. She was related to him. I looked through HOA meeting minutes and found Karen had fought aggressively to increase surveillance in the neighborhood, even pushing for private patrols paid for by resident fees. She was obsessed with control, with authority. It wasn't just about aesthetics or noise complaints. It was about power. I even spoke to a couple of neighbors under the guise of casual conversation. Most were hesitant, nervous even, but one finally opened up. He told me Karen had once threatened to report him to immigration because his lawn wasn't mowed during a vacation. The man had lived in the US for over 20 years. I was seeing the bigger picture now. Karen was a bully with a history, and if she felt like her control was slipping, she escalated. She used fear as her weapon. But what she didn't count on was someone willing to stand up and connect the dots. I wasn't just going to expose her. I was going to make sure she never did this to anyone again. And for that, I needed bigger help than the local police. I needed someone who could take impersonating a federal officer very, very seriously. It felt surreal, dialing the number for the local FBI field office. I never imagined I'd be reporting something like this, not as a bystander or a witness, but as the target of something so bizarre and dangerous. The receptionist transferred me to an agent, and I introduced myself calmly, even though my heart was pounding. I explained everything from the top. How 3 men dressed as police officers came to my door. How they tried to intimidate me into stepping outside. How the police confirmed they weren't legitimate. And how I believed it was all connected to my HOA neighbor, Karen. The agent didn't dismiss me. He didn't laugh or shrug it off. Instead, he asked detailed questions. What did the uniforms look like? Did they show any identification? What kind of vehicle were they driving? Did I have video evidence? I told him yes to all of it. I had high-definition security footage, audio recordings, and a trail of behavior leading right back to the woman next door. When I mentioned Karen's son and the impersonation charge on his record, the agent went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That changes things." He asked me to email everything I had, footage, the threatening note, the HOA complaints, even screenshots of Karen's past HOA involvement. I sent it all, organizing the files like I was building a case. And in a way, I was. Within 2 days, I received a follow-up call. The agent confirmed they were opening an inquiry. Impersonating a federal officer, even indirectly, is no joke. It's a serious federal offense, especially when it's used to intimidate or manipulate civilians. They asked if I'd be willing to make a formal statement in person. I agreed without hesitation. When I showed up at their office, they treated me with professionalism and a clear sense of purpose. One of the agents said, "This isn't the first case we've seen involving community authority figures pushing boundaries, but it's rare someone has this much documented." I walked them through everything again, this time with dates, names, context. When I left, they assured me they'd be visiting Karen soon, but they couldn't say when. "We prefer surprise visits," one of them said with a half smile. That was the first time I felt a sliver of relief, like the tide was finally turning. Karen had pushed too far. She'd tried to use fear as her leverage, to scare me into silence, but instead, she'd opened a door she couldn't close. And now, it wasn't just me knocking, it was the FBI. It happened on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after my visit to the FBI office. I hadn't heard anything since, and honestly, part of me wondered if it would all just quietly disappear into paperwork and red tape. But then, just as I was watering my front lawn, I saw 2 black SUVs roll down the street, sleek, official, and unmistakable. They parked right in front of Karen's house. The neighborhood, normally quiet and half asleep at that hour, seemed to pause. Curtains twitched. Garage doors froze mid-close. And there they were, 2 men and 1 woman in dark suits, stepping out with crisp authority, walking straight to Karen's door. She answered it within seconds, probably expecting it to be another neighbor she could boss around. But the moment she saw who was standing on her porch, her posture changed. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw the expression on her face, the forced smile, the flicker of confusion, and then the unmistakable drop into panic. They didn't enter her house. They kept it all outside, public, visible. It was deliberate. She tried to maintain control, gesturing, talking quickly, but they didn't flinch. They were calm, professional, and completely unfazed by whatever story she was trying to spin. Neighbors started coming out under the guise of taking out trash or checking the mail, casually inching closer, pretending not to watch. One even walked their dog past 3 times. Everyone knew something serious was happening. Word traveled fast. Within an hour, The entire HOA board had called an emergency meeting. Karen didn't show up. Her seat at the table was empty for the first time in years. And in that meeting, they voted unanimously to suspend her from all HOA responsibilities pending investigation. It wasn't just about the fake cops anymore. It was the paper trail, the intimidation, the misuse of her position, and the toxic atmosphere she'd created. Later that week, I found out through a neighbor who worked in the legal field that Karen had been officially named in an inquiry. She wasn't arrested, but the federal investigation was ongoing, and the agents had made it very clear that further incidents would result in charges. She stopped walking by my house. Her porch light stayed off. Her emails to the board ceased. Within 3 weeks, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't leave a note. One day she was there, and the next, she was gone. But her absence was louder than anything she ever said. Justice didn't arrive with sirens. It came in quiet, confident steps, and it was enough. A few months passed, and the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, or at least what normal felt like without Karen looming over everything. The HOA meetings became more relaxed. Neighbors started chatting on sidewalks again, and for the first time since I'd moved in, the air felt lighter. People who had once kept their heads down started speaking up, sharing stories about their own run-ins with her. It turned out I wasn't the only one she'd tried to scare into silence, just the first one to push back hard enough. One morning, as I was checking my mail, I found an envelope tucked inside with no return address. It was official looking, stamped with the emblem of the Department of Justice. Inside was a short letter from the FBI, thanking me for my cooperation and assistance in an ongoing investigation. They couldn't share many details, but the message was clear. What I did mattered. They had taken the case seriously. It wasn't just about me. It was about setting a precedent. When someone tries to abuse power, whether it's through false authority or sheer intimidation, standing up can make a difference. That letter stayed with me. Not just physically, I kept it in a drawer by my desk, but emotionally. It reminded me that even in a quiet neighborhood, in a house like any other, real battles can unfold. People like Karen count on fear. They thrive on control, and they expect everyone to stay silent. But silence only works if no one speaks up. The fake cops she sent to my door were meant to frighten me into submission. Instead, they triggered something far bigger than she ever expected. The real twist in this story isn't just that the FBI got involved. It's that someone like Karen, who believed she was untouchable, who treated herself like judge, jury, and executioner of suburban law, was undone by the very thing she tried to use: authority. She wanted to scare me with fake power. In the end, she got buried by the real thing. Looking back, I'm not glad it happened, but I'm glad I stood my ground. Sometimes, doing the right thing means being uncomfortable, being afraid, and pushing through anyway. And if this story reminds even one person that bullies fall the hardest when you shine a light on them, then maybe it was all worth it.